Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. For today's episode in our series about the history of bad ideas, I'm talking to the writer and journalist Helen Lewis about the arguments that were made against giving women the vote, and in particular, the arguments that were made by women against giving women the vote. There are actually a series of bad ideas we're going to be talking about today. Many different kinds of arguments were made in different contexts. But one of the surprising things is how some of these arguments still seem to have some cachet today. We try and explain why, and we go through all the things that can be said against them. This episode of Past, Present, Future is sponsored by Faber. Great books change how you see the world around you, an adage that rings particularly true with a recent release from Faber, The Rising Down, Lives in a Sussex Landscape by Alexandra Harris. From the award-winning author of Romantic Moderns and Weatherland, this is a journey through one area's unexpected past that uncovers a world in a grain of sand. When celebrated cultural historian Alexandra Harris returned to her childhood home of West Sussex, she realised she barely knew the place at all. Who has stood here, she asks. What did they see? From John Constable and Ford Madox Ford to the far-sighted political writer Charlotte Smith, these electrifying encounters make up a luminous feat of travel through time and space. Called remarkable by the Times, wonderful by the Guardian, fascinating by the Telegraph, The Rising Down is out now in hardback, and exclusively for listeners to PPF, Faber is offering 20% off. Go to faber.co.uk and use the code podcast at checkout. The bad idea we're talking about here is essentially the argument against giving women the vote at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and particularly women against giving women the vote. There was a movement called the Women's Anti-Suffrage League. And it's partly because in this series, one of the things we're interested in is things that I think I'm taking a punt here. I think most people listening to this would recognize that wanting to deny the vote to women is a bad idea. But some of these ideas are passionately adopted by people you wouldn't say are bad, not Nazis, not evil people, well-intentioned people. I got interested in this when I was looking into the parallels between the arguments against enfranchising women and the arguments that are made today against enfranchising children. And there are interesting parallels. But I found myself drawn into the arguments against enfranchising women because they were really passionately held. Articulate, intelligent, well-informed people, including intelligent, well-informed women, the start of the 20th century were dead against it. They thought it was giving women the vote was a really big mistake. What I'd like to do is sort of go through some of those arguments and maybe try and understand them, but also some of them have interesting contemporary parallels. So it's not like when women got the vote, the arguments against giving women the vote disappeared. They morphed into something else. So here are some of the things that women were saying against the enfranchisement of women early 20th century, so a bit more than 100 years ago. One was that women have power, but they have power in certain spheres of life. So the early 20th century view was the home was where women exercise real authority, the family, personal relationships, education, the bringing up of children. And the argument against enfranchisement was that would dilute that power because women were going to be given something that men already had, and they were going to be given it on the same terms of men and expected to deploy this new power in a world that is clearly dominated by men. And therefore, actually, what they were being offered, a vote, would dilute the power that they had. Now, I think there are lots of things to be said against that argument, but Helen, how does it strike you as a view of one of the things that might go wrong with female enfranchisement? That it's, in a sense, the vote is it's a sort of sop which actually will diminish women's power in the long run.
Yeah, that's an argument that recurs quite a lot during feminism. I mean, now we'd probably think of it as the separate spheres argument or complementarity of the two ways that it gets described now. And it's the idea that men and women have different roles, different biology, different interests. And, you can't turn women into kind of ersatz men, essentially. So, that it was a very powerful argument. I mean, the kind of founding document of anti-suffrage in Britain was this letter in 1889 to a journal called The 19th Century, Dictionary, which of course at the time was quite a current name for a journal to be called. But it was signed by some people with sort of comedy aristocratic names, but also quite a lot of people that you would kind of later go on to have heard of. So Beatrice Potter, as she was then, later Beatrice Webb, who was later one of the Fabians, who also, I don't know if this came up in your conversation with Adam Rutherford on eugenics, big supporter of eugenics. She signed it. So 2 for 2 on bad ideas from Beatrice Webb there. She kind of later recanted, not exactly recanted, but moved away from it. But there were serious intellectuals, and the kind of driving powerhouse behind that particular anti-suffrage society was a woman called Mrs. Humphrey Ward. She always referred to herself by her married name. And the fascinating thing about her is that she was incredibly accomplished. She was the family's breadwinner for a while on her romance novels. She was very strongly in favour of Oxford University admitting women. She was involved in the founding of Somerville College. So as you say, yeah, these were not people who just fundamentally thought women should be kind of barefoot and pregnant. They actually had lots of ways in which they thought women should be involved in civic life. The argument was not the vote. Now, Millicent Fawcett, who was the leader of the suffragists, the non-violent campaigners for the women's vote, was quite sharp about them because she noticed that they seemed to always be in favour of women having all of the advances that they'd had right up till then, but absolutely no more at all. And that's something that comes up a lot when you talk about politics, which is that it's really hard to roll back rights. Once you've given people rights for the first time, it's really, if you tried now to overturn the minimum wage, which at the time was incredibly contested in British politics, the Tories were dead against it, said it would, lead loads of businesses to go under. If you now tried to take that away, there would be kind of, real grim upheaval. Look at the situation now in America with the rollback of abortion rights. Once people have kind of tasted those rights, they really don't want them taken away again. And so if you're against them, you really need to not ever let them happen in the first place. And that was the kind of situation I think the anti-suffragists found themselves in. They were arguing that it was fine for women to vote in local elections, fine for women to be involved in education, but the one thing that was the kind of sticking block that they absolutely mustn't have was the vote in national elections.
And I think there was a suspicion that they were being sold something that was being oversold, in the sense that the fear was, the argument would be, well, now we've given you the vote, we can kind of ignore you again. And, I don't think that suspicion is entirely unfounded. I've just been reading Trollope, one of the Palliser novels, Phineas Redux, in which one of the characters, a very wealthy, very accomplished woman who has a sort of salon in London where all the politicians come, a real mover and a shaker. And she's asked about a looming great parliamentary debate. Are you going to go and sit in the women's gallery to watch? And she says, God, no. It's awful as a woman to be forced into this little box where you have to look in on the men. I could do it as well as they can. And the idea I just have to sit up there and watch the men doing it is intolerable to me. I'd rather not be involved at all. And then the character speaking to her says, oh my God, are you one of those terrifying women who believes in women voting? And she says, no, of course not. I sort of think that would be a version of the same thing. The implication being, you men are always offering us a sort of opportunity to watch what you do. And, maybe some women would be elected to parliament, but we know that took about 100 years. So again, the suspicion that women being given the vote would actually be another kind of ringside seat to male politics. There is some force to that. It's not an argument for not giving women the vote, but it is possible to understand why that fear was real.
Yeah, it gets mentioned now because one of the parliaments that's got the highest female participation rate is the Rwandan parliament. And the argument there is that they don't mind lots of women being in parliament because they don't have any power. Paul Kagame gets to decide what happens. And so, the idea is that, yes, the same thing happened when there were moves to get far more women on FTSE 100 boards. What happened was that they all rigged it by giving them non-executive directorship. So they didn't actually have any real power, but they were sitting on the board. So there has been a very real fear that the structures of power don't actually change. You just kind of give a tokenistic, letting women through the front door. The other thing I should say is that there were very lively debates, even within the suffragette movement itself, about whether or not class or sex was the thing that was really the biggest thing holding women back. So Annie Kenney, who was probably the highest ranking working class woman in the Women's Social and Political Union, the suffragette organisation, wrote in her memoir specifically about this. She was from an incredibly poor background, one of, I think, 11 children, left school before 16. And she wrote that actually she had always been conscious that it was her sex that was holding her back more than her class. But that, again, was an argument that was deeply contested. And the reason that Sylvia Pankhurst, daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, was thrown out of the Women's Social Political Union, among other things, was that she stood on a platform with Keir Hardie of the Independent Labour Party that had just recently been founded. That was an explicitly class-based appeal, and saying that, it's working people, working men, whose rights need to be attended to next in this context. So there has always been that argument about, are women really held back as women? Can you even talk about a political grouping of women when women's lives are so diverse and they make up 51% of the population? And you're right, actually, in that 1889 letter, there were a couple of things that also came up, which is one, that women don't serve in the army. They're not violent. So how can they make laws when we know that force is needed to uphold laws and women don't use force? Another one was the idea that they had a better role in being above political partisanship. They were more interesting as effective independent advocates, whereas being drawn into sort of besmirched party politics was going to kind of demean them and devalue them. So all that came up. But also, yes, essentially there was a big argument about the fact that it would disrupt their essential feminine natures. I found a great quote from Angela Dickens, granddaughter of Charles Dickens, who said, "What was called the irresponsible vote, the vote of the man who does not know and does not care, was already sufficiently large. Woman, if she devotes her time to domestic work, what time had she for the study of imperial politics?" Yeah, so there was a kind of snobby feeling that actually, and this were times when there were big debates about whether or not you'd let working class men vote. Actually, did we really want to expand the franchise to all of these people who didn't really follow politics and didn't really know what was going on?
And some of that snobbiness is there with the most celebrated advocates of female enfranchisement. So John Stuart Mill notoriously wanted women to vote because he wanted educated women to counteract the negative effects of allowing all these uneducated men. So after the Second Reform Act, his fear was that the franchise had been diluted because there weren't enough checks on whether people were qualified to vote. And the way to counter that, because many women by that point were extremely well educated, was to enfranchise educated women to counteract working class men. It's also the case, it really struck me when I was reading about this, that argument that some of the women who are against women's suffrage made, which was kind of, we're being sold a bit of a con here, we're being sold something that is not all it's cracked up to be, is an argument for the enfranchisement of women, because a lot of men said we can't enfranchise women because it's too dangerous. It would really destabilize the political system. And you get that with each great enfranchisement. There are always a group of people who say this is dangerous because these people have been denied the vote. So if you suddenly give them the vote, they're going to be really radical. They're going to be cross, they're going to be angry, they're going to express their frustration at the ways they've been excluded in the first round of voting. The counter to that is it never happens, or it almost never happens.
No, it never happens. And also the argument was being made simultaneously at the time in the early 1900s. The Liberals and the Independent Labour Party were both very, very reluctant on women's suffrage because they all thought women were going to be conservatives. They thought women were naturally in favour of the status quo because they had so much to lose with their family responsibilities. They wouldn't be sufficiently radical enough. And so it was a very strange situation in which, they were not, as you would imagine from the kind of left-wing progressive positioning of those parties now, but, advocates for women's suffrage because they thought in crude electoral terms it wasn't going to work out very well for them.
And in ways it didn't. The great lesson on the whole with the big enfranchisements is that if you enfranchise a sufficiently large group, they're likely to behave like the already existing voters do. That is, they will behave in lots of different ways. But certainly it was the case that post-female enfranchisement in the UK after 1918 and then after 1928, yes, there was briefly a Labour government. But those 2 decades were dominated by Tory election victories, and many women lay behind that. Women on the whole, early on at least, were more conservative than they were radical.
Yeah, Emmeline Pankhurst stood for Parliament in Smethwick in one of the elections in the 20s. And, some of the suffragettes went on to be quite radical left-wing actions, and some of them went on to join the British Union of Fascists. They were an interesting group of people who were united by that one cause, but they didn't have a kind of coherent political philosophy, that was united on what they thought the tax situation should be, or the answer to the Irish question, or whatever it might be. There was definitely that. And that's really one of the interesting things about what's happened in politics recently is that women have now switched in Britain, following the trend in other countries, and become more likely to vote for left-wing parties. And the thesis of that being that they have more direct contact with social services, welfare, safety nets, and they want a big, generous state. They don't prioritize entrepreneurship and low taxes. They prioritize the stability and the welfare system.
It's true. And actually, what's so interesting, as you say, about much, much more recent politics. So in the long history, the 100-year history in the United States, in Britain, of female enfranchisement, there haven't been many moments where you can say women as a bloc have voted radically differently from men. And including very recently, so on Brexit, for instance, there are lots of ways in which you can apply a test, ask a question of a voter, and that will give you a strong indication of how they were likely to vote. So education and age were the two classic ones. Did you go to university? How old are you? Are you a man or are you a woman? Told you almost nothing on Brexit. I mean, the gender difference was tiny. But more recently, it is really pronounced. And I was reading an article just yesterday in the New York Times about what many people have noticed is the big divergence among people under 30 in the United States and their likelihood to support Donald Trump. So young men are much more pro-Trump even than they were 4 years ago. And young women are, if anything, even more anti-Trump. Not necessarily pro-Biden, but anti-Trump. And in this article, it said, this is a sufficiently big enough divergence that it almost looks like it has to be explained by an event. Something must have happened, because this almost never happens. Male-female is not the dividing line in politics, but it is now. And then there were speculation about what that might be. Abortion and the rollback of abortion rights might be one. Different kinds of interactions with social media might be another. But it is interesting. It's taken us 100 years for the thing that people said would happen when women were enfranchised to happen, which is men and women are now voting differently.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and that has been quite pronounced. I remember there was a big backlash in 2016, if you spent any time on Twitter, about the fact that so many white women specifically had voted for Donald Trump. Yeah, I think it was close to 50%, whereas among black women, to 96% Clinton. And so there was a kind of classic, let's blame white women for Donald Trump, because they should have known, right? They should have known he was a sexist and whatever, and voted, on sort of feminist grounds for the female candidate, and they didn't. And it made me remember at the time, there's a great phrase by Andrea Dworkin, which is, women are the only oppressed class who are required to sleep with their oppressors. And that's a very blunt Andrea Dworkin way of putting it. But it is true. Women's organising has always been inhibited by the fact that women, quite a lot of them are straight. So they have husbands, partners, they might have sons or brothers or fathers. They are enmeshed in ways that more discrete minority groups are not, with people with very different political interests to them. And that was one of the things that the anti-suffragists really worried about. They said, well, what would happen if you ended up with a wife who wanted to vote differently from her husband? It would be insupportable. He's the head of the household. And in a way, that was not a ridiculous thing to worry about, because I think lots of the time people do end up in voting as a family bloc. And lots of women do end up voting with their partner's interests rather than strictly their own. And that's probably what you see in the Trump thing. So the fact that those under 30s women haven't got there yet might also be explained by the fact that they're not yet married to the Trump-supporting young men, right? It would be interesting to check in on those same people in 10 years' time. Have the men got more left-wing, or have the women got more right-wing? I would probably call it's more likely to be that the women will have got more right-wing.
To go back to what you were describing, which is that range of arguments that you got in that letter, you also get it in the manifesto of the Women's Anti-Suffrage League. And one of them, as you said, was politics is a man's game. And part of the reason it's a man's game is that it is based on physical force, including decisions about war. Armies then were exclusively male. And they're not exclusively male now, but they are still predominantly male. And violence in warfare is a male thing. It's men killing men. Certainly back then it was. And therefore, women are not, it's not that they're not qualified, but there would be something incongruous about a female prime minister sending young men to war. We've been through versions of female prime ministers sending young men to war to know it's not incongruous. But the other thing that's really striking about it is that the same argument is not applied to the men. It's not, therefore, you have to have soldier politicians. By that point, they weren't soldier politicians. A few of them were, but the vast majority were professional politicians who would be no more equipped to fight a war than the women were. And it is also a feature of all of these enfranchisement movements and the arguments that are made against them, which is that the competence test or the appropriateness test, you're going to be making decisions outside of your sphere of knowledge or interest or expertise, is not applied to the existing political class, which is stuffed full of amateur incompetence. I mean, you really sense it in that early 20th century version. This is not, Greek city-states in which soldier, statesmen, politicians are fighting the wars and then deciding about the peace. This is the age of professional politics.
Yeah, you definitely see it with Trump. If you think about his critics and his opponents, for a long time, one of his most prominent critics within the Republican Party was John McCain, who's got an incredible story from the Vietnam War, taken prisoner. And as an admiral's son, he refused to be released until it was kind of his turn. He didn't want special treatment. Tortured so badly, he couldn't lift his arms above his head in later life. And then Trump, who claimed he had bone spurs in his feet and got out of serving in Vietnam, then attacks a Gold Star family, a family who'd lost a son in the Iraq War, because of their ethnicity, goes at some point to a cemetery with his chief of staff and says the people who died here are losers and suckers, and criticizes John McCain. And it doesn't hurt him with the same people who probably, if had they lived in 1900, would have told you that women couldn't be in charge of stuff because they didn't understand military matters. So that one, I think, does really feel like very much an argument of expediency. The other one that similarly I would regard like that, there's a lot of discussion about the fact that women didn't want the vote anyway. Weren't there more things that women wanted more? And that is often, anti-feminist arguments often take that tack, which is this is actually only a minor issue. This is a kind of frippery. This is a distraction from real politics. And you often find that. I found that definitely when I was writing Difficult Women, my history of feminism, in the stuff about women being admitted to universities. You get this kind of, actually women have got bigger problems than this. What about working class women? And then you go, well, okay, we'll sort that, but can we just have women in the universities? And then that's the point at which the protests start and people start getting kind of excrement hurled at them and, they change the rules to dismiss them. But there is always that kind of, women have got other things on their mind.
On the question of women and war, how much difference do you think, in Britain anyway, Margaret Thatcher's premiership made to how people think about this? Because it was an unusual time in British politics. There she was, not at the beginning, but by the end, as the only woman in her cabinet. I think the final cabinets, weren't they? They were all male apart from her.
She had Lady Janet, what's her name? Yeah, and that was it.
Yeah, there are photos. And the weirdness of those photos is not just it's one woman and 23 men, but the men are interchangeable, identical 55-year-old, semi-balding, grey-haired men in blue suits. But the Falklands War really, it was a watershed in her political career, but also in the way people talked about and thought about that question of women and war and the military. Her whole persona changed. Do you think it did shift anything in the way that people talk about or think about women and war? She was the first female prime minister, and then she came to symbolize a certain version of the kind of martial spirit.
Yeah, what's that quote for the eyes of, what is it, the eyes of Caligula in the mouth of Marilyn Monroe? Is it the other? I can't remember, it's the other way around. I'm not sure which version of that would be, which you want, the mouth of Caligula in the eyes of Marilyn Monroe. Who can say? But yeah, you're right. I went and researched a while ago that Tory leadership election in whatever it was, the early 1970s, that brought her to power, because it is really fascinating. How do you get a group of kind of fuddy-duddy reactionary Tory MPs to vote for not just a young woman, but also one who was very firmly positioned as being on the right of the party? She was not a kind of steady as she goes candidate at that point. And I think it's really oddly fluky in some ways that she got in. I think in a way there were some people who expected her to fail, and she just defied all of their expectations. But the thing that I found fascinating about her is I think she followed Barbara Castle as a kind of template in what I think of as kind of iron femininity, which was just this kind of slightly sort of Miss Whiplashy, slightly dominatrixy. There was a kind of sense of female power that was very, it was very feminine in a very tough way. And I think that provided women in the Tory party with a kind of template of what a female leader looked like and what a kind of wartime leader looked like. That she could be on the top of a tank, but in a lovely pussy blouse and a bright red jacket. She found a way of marrying the two things up in a way that I don't think anyone in Britain had really done since probably like Boadicea, basically.
There's a story, I think it ends the second volume, or maybe it's the first volume of Charles Moore's biography of Thatcher, and it's clearly it's close to a certain kind of fantasy for a certain kind of Tory man, which is the story of the celebratory dinner after the Falklands. I think it was a year later, where with all of the admirals and the military chiefs and all of the men who'd been involved in this campaign, they had this great dinner, this great banquet, and then after the banquet, there were speeches, and then after the speeches, Thatcher got up and she said to the assembled room, "Gentlemen, shall we join the ladies?" Because the ladies were in another room. And that, for some Tory men, that's as good as it gets.
Well, that's Gloriana, right? That's Elizabeth I. That's I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. That you essentially say, it's not all women. I'm the exception. And I've always thought about this, that Labour, who still haven't had a female leader, well done, after more than 120 years, have made this slightly more tricky argument, which is that I want all women have got the chance to rise, rather than just occasional exceptional women. And there is a strange counterintuitive sense that the Tories, by insisting on the exceptionalism of female leaders, have managed to get 3 more of them than Labour have managed.
And it's one of the ironies of the anti-suffrage argument, which is that somehow it's assumed that women in politics will be sort of typical, but any prime minister is going to be an atypical human being. They're all weird in theory. They all have particular talents. None of them sort of stand in for, the men don't stand in for all men. Almost by definition, the ones who make it to the top are not going to be just generic versions of the thing that you're arguing about. There is a huge difference, and there was a historical difference between the enfranchisement of women and women reaching the top of British politics, but somehow these two things got conflated. And it got conflated in the biology as well. So I was really struck reading some of this stuff by how quickly the opponents of women's suffrage, including the women against it, would move from saying, women aren't really cut out for this because, to go back to our earlier conversation, they tend to be a bit hysterical or emotional or whatever it is, to imagine a woman at the dispatch box at the wrong time of the month, or imagine, there was one which was just said, clearly this is the limit case, this could never happen, a pregnant Chancellor of the Exchequer. That was the sort of definitive case of something that simply was clearly impossible. The assumption being that somehow quite quickly you get from these sort of prejudicial views of the biological difference between men and women to this idea that at the top of politics, these biological differences would be so grotesque and visible that they would make it impossible. Whereas, the men at the top of politics are also biologically unsuited in all sorts of ways. I always find myself thinking that really the argument goes the other way. These were elderly men back then, all of whom, elderly men have way more health problems than elderly women.
Yes, how will they sit through an entire debate when their prostate's giving them terrible trouble? Yeah, you could make the argument that way too.
There was an obituary of a leading prostate doctor not that long ago in the Times that said that he treated the entire Wilson cabinet in the 1970s, presumably apart from Barbara Castle. So, the double standards are astonishing, but somehow biology rears its head for the women, but not for the men.
But also there has been that tension, and you still see it in feminism now, between social constructionism and biological essentialism. How different are men and women on average, and how different are they at the edge cases? And that one, is still raging to the extent it is today. Because one of the anti-suffrage arguments was, but women don't want this anyway. They're not driven to succeed in the way that men are, and that would not in any way be compatible with being a wife and a mother. And that was a really compelling argument. It took a really long time, essentially until 1997. There were a tiny handful all the way through. I think the most there were was sort of 30 female MPs up until the kind of quote unquote Blair's babes, which obviously we won't get into. Not the happiest name for them. I don't think they particularly like that. But that was the real kind of big bang. And now you have a situation in which actually the Labour Parliamentary Party is majority female. So you've ended up in this situation where, actually, do you need all women shortlists anymore? Has that barrier been removed? So, I always think there's a kind of God of the gaps argument about some of these advances with women, which is that you just find the smallest problem. Oh, women don't want this. Oh, women can't do this. Oh, they won't do it. And then you get to the end of it when it turns out that women can do it and they do want to do it. And you argue that the final one is they can do it, but it's making them unhappy. And you get a lot of that in the suffragette discourse, and you get a lot of that today. I was just looking at Jordan Peterson, my old sparring partner, the psychologist turned culture warrior, was complaining about the sheer number of student protests in America who were young women. And he said, these childless harpies long to be dominated by Hamas. And in a number of ways, it was a particularly bizarre comment, given that they're 19. Like, how many children do you really want them to have had by that point? But it was also this sort of sense that any political power exercised by women is not only weird, but will also make them unhappy. They'd be much happier at home with their children, and they should stop deluding themselves that this is what they want. And as you say, I could point to any number of male politicians. Edward Heath is a fairly obvious example, who power seems to have made pretty miserable and were in quite a bad mood for many decades after losing power. But that's never held to be, well, then men are kind of unsuitable and it makes them unhappy.
And it is partly an argument about democratic politics and the fact that the kind of people who are drawn to it are unusual. I mean, drawn to it as a career, not. There is a difference between enfranchisement of women and then the case and the question of women in parliament. But like you say, lots of people would be made unhappy by I think I would be made I think I would be made deeply unhappy by a political career. I don't think I'm cut out for it. It requires a certain kind of temperament. And so it's not a fallacious argument to say that many women might not suit the demands of a political career, but it is a fallacious argument if it's not also applied to men. And that's the thing that is true right the way across these anti-female suffrage arguments, which is that the same argument could easily be applied to men, and it's not. There's something weird about being interested in politics. So the case would be then made that these kind of women who are interested in politics are a bit odd. Well, maybe they are, but like you say, they're no odder than the men.
Well, that's one of the things I think is most fascinating about the suffragettes as a group. I was trying to think, and maybe you've got much bigger knowledge of politics than me. Can you think of any other all-female terrorist group or guerrilla group, however you want to phrase it, political guerrilla group?
Off the top of my head, no.
No, I mean, I know I put you on the spot, but it is a very, very rare thing. The Women's Social and Political Union, which numbered about, I think, 1,200, 1,500 people at its absolute peak, fewer active members. But, they were absolutely committed to political violence as a legitimate protest tactic. And that escalated from, window smashing to bombings, to arson. They bombed the Chancellor's home, luckily while he wasn't there. But, they were very blasé by the end about the possibility that they might kill people. The Kennys were raided and they essentially had a kind of bomb-making factory in their flat. And I think that's part of what they wanted to do. Christabel Pankhurst wrote about kind of smashing the idea of delicate femininity. They wanted to show that women weren't the kind of Victorian angel in the house that they've been painted as. And part of the reason that they did that was that was the argument of the anti-suffrage campaigners. But on the other side, the anti-suffrage campaigners took a huge amount of force from the fact that they were saying, oh my God, we're not like those ghastly women who are completely lost the run of themselves, who are kind of termagants and harpies and standing up in public meetings. And the other argument that I think we mentioned it earlier, that I always try and stress when I'm talking about this period is, as you say, enfranchising women would have instantly made women a majority of voters. And actually, when in 1918, when women did get the vote in Britain, they were instantly a majority of voters because so many men had died in the First World War. So when you're thinking about that, you realise quite how radical an ask that was. That's as radical an ask as, ending apartheid in South Africa. It's saying we're going to give this group of people that we've been oppressing for a really long time actually majority power. And let's hope they're nicer to us with it than we were to them. And as you say, as it turned out, the women didn't do anything particularly radical with the vote. But I can, in that context, understand the fears slightly more than you would otherwise think in retrospect.
In the American case, it's a longer story, both in a sense that the arguments for the enfranchisement of women go back deeper into the 19th century. The movement starts in many ways in the United States, but also because the anti-arguments have a longer afterlife in the United States through to today. I mean, voter suppression is still more of a feature of American politics. It tends to be on the basis of race, but you can imagine a future where it might not just be on the basis of race. For instance, if young women don't want to vote for Trump, but young men do, no reason why you can't use the same laws that try and stop Black Americans from voting to stop women from voting. But through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the social revolutions that went beyond enfranchisement to all sorts of other aspects of women's rights produced a furious reaction in America that drew on many of these earlier arguments. I mean, you can hear the echoes of the Women's Anti-Suffrage League in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s American politics, and not just from men. It's not just men who are saying this. Famously, it's women too.
Yeah, and I think there's many things that are wrong about the American political system. The kind of idea that you have 2 senators from every state, no matter whether, it's 300 people in Wyoming or millions in New York. But one of them is the idea that the Supreme Court decides everything, because that does make the composition of who's in the Supreme Court suddenly very important. And it also means that difficult decisions don't get taken by the legislature and kind of bedded in. they get taken by the whim of who's got a majority on the Supreme Court. The abortion decision, the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade being a really obvious example. Because there was that constitutional protection under Roe, lots of states didn't really get round to making proper abortion laws in their own states, or they let old statutes linger. And then suddenly, stroke of a pen, overnight, you're ending up with these incredibly draconian laws that basically no one, even Republicans in those states, want. And so a group of kind of highly motivated, I would say in this case, misogynists, are able to have have this incredible level of power. Minority rule is really embedded all the way through the American political system. But you're right, I don't know if you watched it, the brilliant thing, I don't know who did it originally, but it was bought by the BBC, Mrs. America, starring Kate Blanchett as Phyllis Schlafly, told the story of trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified in all of the states, which never happened. But it was very smart, I thought, about the way that the women's movement was portrayed as being kind of essentially middle-class women without real problems, and the way that the kind of backlash to that also got wrapped up with the pro-life movement, and therefore drafted in lots of particularly Christian women, women in red states who were persuaded that this was, that abortion was a bigger deal than women's rights, essentially, and they should therefore be on the side of kind of cultural conservatism for that reason. So the American context is just completely different in a lot of ways, as you say, not least because race and suffrage are just wrapped up. After the abolition of slavery, it then moved the discussion to who would get the vote first. Would it be women, or would it essentially white women, or would it be black men? And those two groups were kind of played off against each other for quite a long time. So it's a much more difficult story. And I think the way that it happened in Britain it's really fascinating how little attempt there was after 1918 to undo it, right? The Anti-Suffrage League essentially just dissolved and sort of packed up and went home at that point. I can't see that it had any real lasting influence in the 20s. And that's interesting in itself, the fact that once the argument was kind of lost, it was settled as well.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any sign, even in the United States, like I say, voter suppression is a thing, but literal disenfranchisement is still, I think, outside the Overton window, even the Trumpian Overton window. But it's also the case, maybe particularly in the United States, but also here, that version of feminism, enfranchisement feminism, rights-based feminism focused on politics and the political sphere, does get squeezed in the 60s, 70s, 80s from both sides. So both the conservative reaction, but also the more radical feminist response, Catherine McKinnon, Andrea Dworkin and others, which is an echo of that earlier argument, which is this is just voting. It's nowhere near enough. It is a kind of SOP. That version of rights-based feminism where women are given a certain kind of legal status, of which enfranchisement is a paradigmatic example, in a patriarchal world, is actually simply window dressing. So it's not like there was then a movement to disenfranchise women, but the enfranchisement of women starts to look like the thing that some of those earlier critics said it might be, which is not all that.
Right. I mean, you'd still rather have it than not. But I think, there was a feeling that...
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But you're right. And one of the things that...
I'm not saying not.
Bold statement to come out with. But I think you're right, is that one of the things that's really interesting to me is the afterlife of the suffragettes. And actually, you know what? They don't, by and large, do much political campaigning, as I say, with the exceptions of, what's her name, Mary, the general who became leader of the women's section of the British Union of Fascists, and then discovered that their maternity leave policies weren't all that, and left. But the suffragettes were sort of exhausted by the fight to win the vote. Annie Kenney retired, had kids, and sort of ran a boarding house. Constance Lytton, retired to the country. Emmeline Pankhurst ran for Parliament but never got in. The woman who was the flagship female suffragette never managed to make it to Parliament. And the first two women who make it to Parliament are a Sinn Féin member who never takes her seat, and then a woman who takes the seat of her departed husband. So that's also kind of fascinating to me that, as you say, they got that, and then in a way the women's movement sort of took a breath for a while because it kind of couldn't really work out what the next target was. Most of that energy maybe moved to the birth control movement. And that's kind of also symptomatic of a conversation that keeps happening in feminism, right? It was easier in some ways to make that rights-based argument you're talking about. We want to be treated just like men. Men have the vote. We want the vote. That's it. And it doesn't matter what class you are, anything, who you're going to vote for. And the tougher stuff then comes after that when you begin arguing for women to be treated differently from men. So we need maternity leave because our bodies are different. And that's special treatment. And so that requires a very different type of argument from the rights-based argument that was all about fairness and equality. Actually, we want to be treated unequally. We want to be treated favourably to us. And I think that those sets of arguments have been harder for feminists to make.
And also it does allow a certain kind of reactionary response, which is back when the argument was still live as to whether women should have the vote, we said you were different. And now here you are coming back to us and telling us that you're biologically different. Clearly, the biological differences are themselves different. The earlier version, it's you're hysterical. Now it's that women's biology means that there are particular needs that have to be met by a welfare state or whatever it is. But in the way that these arguments have an afterlife, it's not like the enfranchisement of women settled the question and those anti-suffrage arguments went away. They come back in these different forms. I don't know to what extent you think there's a real risk, maybe particularly in America, but also here, that actually the afterlife of these arguments could undo some of this. So say arguments about biological difference could play into the hands of people who want to almost, go all the way back.
It's been very interesting looking at what is now called the gender critical movement, because the argument against that has always been you're reducing women to their biology. Oh, you think being a woman is just purely about having a uterus, having a vagina. Isn't that what the sexists said? And it has been interesting to watch people grapple with those arguments to say, well, hang on a minute, what does it mean to be a woman? We always said it wasn't, we we're limited by biology, but now are we arguing that actually in some ways we are? A friend of mine asked me this about whether or not he thought the kind of social construction argument had really taken a dent in British feminism in the last 10 years. And I said, I think it really has. If you read Andrea Dworkin's Right-Wing Women, which is all about sort of anti-feminists on the right in the US, she says, the one thing that they can agree with the feminists on is that men are violent, and particularly men are sexually violent. They just disagree on the way to protect themselves. Is it a case of you hope that you would manage to change men or you'd institute laws, or is it a case that you find a man who protects you? You find the right man and you enter into a monogamous relationship with him, and that thereby protects you. But actually, they're not disagreeing at all on the fact that, the crime statistics show men commit 97% of sexual violence. So the fundamental analysis, both people have accepted that men and women are different. And I think I would say that the British feminist movement in the last 10 years even has moved quite, in order to be able to argue for things like single-sex prisons, single-sex hospital wards, has had to move and adapt to a set of arguments that maybe at the turn of the millennium weren't at all fashionable. There was a kind of feeling that we want to be just like men. We want to be treated just like men. And now the pendulum has swung back again to saying, actually, we have a special set of needs that need to be addressed.
And how do you then view the contortions of the Labour Party recently? The party that's never had a woman leader and its current male leader tying himself up in knots, unable to describe what it is to be a woman in biological terms until almost like last week. As though somehow something is at stake here for them. The Labour Party has tied itself up in knots over this in the way that the Conservative Party hasn't. But it must have something to do with this long history, this sort of sense that something is being given up by going back to describing these arguments in biological terms. And yet it's also the party that's not been able to find a way to allow women to lead it.
I know, and my working assumption at this point would be that, Wes Streeting is currently Shadow Health Secretary, is, I would say, the hot favourite to be the next leader of the Labour Party. And so I'm bracing myself for another round of, isn't it time for a woman? No. I mean, in theory, yes, but in actuality, no.
It's time for a man to say what a woman is, but it's not time for a woman.
Well, but that was really interesting because the Conservatives, they supported self-ID until 2020. And Theresa May was totally on board with that policy. And I thought that they supported that because they thought they had been essentially very late to kind of gay rights. And it's a bit like the kind of, that joke in Fawlty Towers about the Americans being late for the last two world wars and wanting to turn up very promptly for the next one. That they had been late to a lot of the social progressive movements of the 20th century, and they wanted to be nice and early for this one and actually, claim this as their kind of mantle. But the one thing, is the cliche that everybody says about the Conservative parties is that they are ideologically flexible, right? They basically believe in the Conservative Party being in charge of things, and they will kind of evolve into whatever the perfect Pokemon form is to allow them to do that. And so I think when they realised that the strength of feeling about some of those arguments, and they realised how unpopular some of the more postmodern understandings of gender were with just normal, ordinary voters, they jettisoned that with really very few regrets. Whereas Labour, which has always seen itself in principal terms as the champion of minorities, found it difficult to be pragmatic. It was very essential to their conception of the South that they were a feminist party, and they thought this was the new frontier of feminism. And that left them very poorly equipped when a group of left-wing feminists contested that assertion, because they couldn't really arbitrate between these two competing sets of claims. So that's kind of where I think I put it. In the US context, I think it's even tougher, because they just in law use gender all the time as a synonym for sex, because they're kind of Puritan and squeamish. Hopefully what I think of as the moderate compromise that we've achieved in Britain, which is that biological sex really matters in law, but sometimes people express their gender differently to that. And that's part of, normal liberal society, that we're okay with that. I think that kind of conception of it makes much more sense in Britain than it does in the American context, where the two concepts haven't really been separated out in that same way.
It's also the case that Liz Truss was on board for the gender self-ID version, the sort of Theresa May version, until she saw the light and wasn't. But as she's discovered in her attempt to reinvent herself as a kind of Trumpy warrior who might go down well in the States, it's a totally different ballgame over there. So from that perspective, when she speaks at some of those hard right conservative conferences in America, her history in Britain makes her completely beyond the pale, essentially. She's a pragmatic conservative who's now trying to reinvent herself as a culture warrior, but her history betrays her. In America, this is, the stakes are so much higher than that. And that sort of conservative flexibility, that's not part of the equation over there. Liz Truss, to them, looks like someone who sold out.
Well, she looks not bonkers enough, which is very funny to those of us in Britain who think she's now sounds completely bonkers. But you're right, the Republican Party now is a kind of cult of personality around Donald Trump. I mean, I'm not sure it's got a coherent set of principles, because Donald Trump, for example, is very aware of the unpopularity of extreme anti-abortion measures. I think he would favour a kind of European-style 16 weeks kind of compromise. But he's attracting the support of evangelical conservatives nonetheless. So I don't think that American right-wing politics makes sense to me in a way that I think the British Conservative Party in its evolution does. But also you have this situation where the Democratic Party elites are also very out of touch with their median voter, who is a kind of moderate black man in South Carolina, whose views are not those of a white liberal elite living in New York or California. And I think that just America being just that much bigger a country and that more polarized a country has made its arguments about feminism very difficult to have, not least because what is the American feminist movement? You kind of think Planned Parenthood, you had one job. Planned Parenthood in the last 10 years has become the biggest provider of gender hormones to teenagers in America. And however you feel about that particular argument, there was already a job that Planned Parenthood was supposed to be doing, which was defending abortion rights and defending birth control. And they just, got bored of it. It wasn't cool enough anymore. I think feminism goes through cycles of backlash, and it will always happen, because there are some things that are essentially impossible to settle about, what the differences between men and women are and what the happiest form of organizing a society is. America is in a period of profound backlash of anti-feminism in a way that I'm not sure I would say that Britain quite is, although some of the same forces operate here too.
One of the really weird things about Trump, as you say, is that on lots of policy positions, he is to the left of his party, and I suspect in his heart of hearts abortion is one of them. But he also channels a kind of 19th century anti-women voice, which is his squeamishness about women's bodies, which comes through in his rhetoric a lot. I mean, really in sort of striking ways, the ways that women bleed freaks him out. It's partly because he's a germaphobe. He clearly is not comfortable, literally not comfortable in his own skin. On some questions, on some pragmatic policy questions, he is probably a pragmatist. But in his soul, he's a misogynist, and he's freaked out by women's bodies in a way that actually does echo some of those people we were talking about earlier, particularly some of the men, but also actually even some of the women. Victorian women were often freaked out by their own bodies. And there's a squeamishness. I mean, I think, the two words that describe Donald Trump is he's shameless and he's squeamish.
It's funny, isn't it? He's in some ways the world's most unconvincing alpha male, in the sense that he does not give off enthusiastic heterosexual vibes, does he? He doesn't look like someone, although he's paid allegedly for sex with a porn star. His favourite film is Sunset Boulevard, and he used to make people watch it at Camp David. And I think he's obviously someone who's happier in the company of men bullying other men and being at the top of a kind of very male status hierarchy, and women are just the kind of add-ons to that. They don't really figure in politics except as kind of occasional pawns who can be used. He just lives in a very I think what Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick would have called a kind of homosocial world. It's all about men interacting with other men. And I think that is one of the difficulties that women have faced in politics, is there are lots of men in politics who are just much more comfortable with other men.
He also apparently, when Evita came out, went to see it 6 times and saw a vision of a political future for him. So it's worth remembering that his vision of a political future was a blonde woman in a dress doing a certain kind of populist politics. And to me, the defining image of Trump's first presidency was when Theresa May had to hold his hand because he was frightened of going up, I don't want to say 3 flights of stairs, it was 3 stairs, or going down 3 stairs. Like you say, I'm endlessly fascinated by him. He is a really unusual politician, not least in his, for want of a better phrase, gender politics.
I think that's why he is oddly fascinating, because he doesn't make sense, right? All the bits and pieces do not fit together in a way that you would, they don't neatly sort of all line up all the way down the tree. And yeah, his anti-feminism is part of that, because he clearly appeals to a lot of men in America who feel everything's got very feminized. There's this thing that you hear in kind of online right circles, which is the longhouse, the idea that politics has become and society has become feminized. The idea that wokeness, as it's expressed in the workplace, is about feminine passive aggression. We used to have proper fights with each other when we disagreed, and now we all just bitch and snipe and try and cancel each other, and that's what women do. But he does speak to a lot of men who feel that feminism has gone too far. You can't say anything anymore. Culture has become very feminized and prissy. I was reading Joe Rogan's endorsement of David Goggins, who used to be a Navy SEAL, saying, he's one of the people who's standing up against pussified culture. And I think that's what the most obvious expression of anti-feminism in modern politics is the sense that there is no respect for kind of the masculine virtues of aggression and courage, and everything has become very weak and feminine. And so some of the arguments that you kind of see that people were making at the turn of the 20th century about what women would do to politics, you're now seeing the legacy of that people do feel that has in fact happened, and those were prescient warnings that you have got all these sort of dainty fainting hysterics who are mussing up the place by making complaints instead of having proper fights, essentially.
And given those echoes from 100 plus years ago, I hear it too. And when you read that stuff, you hear the contemporary versions of it. But does that make you think that there is a genuine threat of the clock being turned back? I mean, and maybe not in the literal terms of disenfranchisement, but at one remove from that we are hearing late 19th, early 20th century arguments in the 21st century about what women have done to politics in a way that at least potentially means those arguments are live again.
I think that's true. And I also think we're looking at a time in which our public finances are incredibly stretched. We have an aging population and not enough money to pay for their care. Well, who are the people who traditionally would pick up the slack in that? It's the daughters, it's the sisters, it's the nieces. And I think there will be lots of assumption that actually, again, women have kind of got above themselves, and wouldn't they be happier fulfilling these, more familial roles? You already see, I've been to a couple of conservative conferences, the fringy conservative bits. They are by and large obsessed with birth rates. And that's both a kind of racial obsession. The Muslim world has got lots of people in it. What about the white European world? We're losing ground. And it is also an anti-feminist obsession in the sense that women are too busy having careers. And that means that they're not, they don't want to have kids anymore. The funny thing about that being that the happiness research, I think, suggests that single childless women are basically the happiest. They're having great lives. But, they might not be the most fulfilled, because people do say that having children makes them feel fulfilled, but it doesn't necessarily make them feel happy. But the people who are really suffering under that type of politics are young men, young single men who are often very lonely and atomized. And so you have this sad situation in which some of the most obvious advocates of anti-feminism today really are advocates for young men, but they're doing it by saying that the only way to make men happier is to make women less happy. And that's, I think, the real danger that I see going out. The kind of Andrew Tate has kind of now faded away a bit. He was an artifact of a particular time. But that argument will still, I think, be very, very live, that women are now unhappy because of the gains that they've made. And wouldn't they be happier in their natural roles? That 19th century argument is very much still alive.
There is a new edition of our newsletter available now. This one accompanies the first 4 episodes in our series on the history of bad ideas. To get it, just follow the link that comes with the show description and sign up. You can also sign up for PPF Plus, ad-free listening to this podcast, and 2 bonus episodes every month to accompany each of our series. Bonus episodes coming soon, 2 more bad ideas, one of which is what I think is a really bad idea. Coming next on the series, in our regular slot, I'm going to be talking again to the philosopher and journalist Kathleen Stock. This time, we're going to be discussing the death of the author. There have been periods where that's been a very fashionable idea. Authors don't know and don't understand the real meaning of the books and texts that they've written. Kathleen Stock explains why that is not a good way to think about writing or anything else. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.